She wore a white blouse that day. That was all it took. Marcus Chen had been sitting in the open-plan office of Hartwell Logistics in Columbus, Ohio, staring at a spreadsheet full of shipping discrepancies when Rachel Bingham walked past his cubicle on the way to the break room. The blouse was crisp, buttoned to the collar, and utterly unremarkable. Nothing sheer, nothing low-cut. Just white cotton against her sun-kissed forearms as she balanced a coffee mug in one hand and a manila folder in the other. And yet, he looked up. She glanced down. Their eyes met for half a second, long enough for something to pass between them that neither could have named in that moment, but both would remember for years afterward. That was November. By February, Rachel Bingham's marriage was over. By April, so was Marcus's. This is not a love story. This is a story about the things men do to avoid love, and the things that love does to men who think they can control it. Marcus was 42 years old when he met Rachel. He had worked at Hartwell for 16 years, joining when the company was still a scrappy regional outfit operating out of a converted warehouse near the Seine River. Over the years he had risen through the ranks, from junior dispatcher to route coordinator to his current position as operations manager of the Dayton branch. He had a wife, Denise, who taught third grade at an elementary school in the suburb of Upper Arlington. They had a 14-year-old son named Tyler who was gangly, acne-prone, and terrifyingly good at video games. They owned a modest colonial-style house with a red front door and a backyard where Denise grew tomatoes and basil every summer. On paper, Marcus Chen had built the kind of life that American men in their 40s were supposed to want. He had not been happy in years, but he had been comfortable, and for a long time he confused the two. The idea that a man could want something with every fiber of his being and simultaneously dread getting it, really getting it, having it become real and permanent and inescapable, that paradox had never occurred to Marcus until Rachel Bingham walked past his desk in a white blouse and smiled at him for no particular reason. She was 34. Divorced. Worked in the accounts receivable department, 2 floors below Marcus's building. Her given name was Rachel, but her ex-husband had called her Reiki, and she hated it, and somehow that small detail, her aversion to a nickname, her precision about language, became one of the things Marcus fixated on during the long months when he was trying to figure out whether what he felt for her was desire or something more dangerous. He told himself it was admiration at first. Professional admiration. She was meticulous, sharp-tongued when necessary, and she had a way of laughing at her own mistakes that made the whole office feel lighter. She was tall, 5'7", nearly as tall as Marcus in his work shoes, and she carried herself with a kind of deliberate grace, as though every movement had been considered and found worthy. She had dark hair she wore in a loose ponytail, brown eyes that crinkled at the corners when she smiled, and a small scar on her left wrist from a childhood fall off a bicycle. He knew all of this about her because he had learned it in pieces, over lunches he engineered in the company cafeteria, over after-work drinks at the pub on Broad Street where the lights were dim enough to flatter, over phone calls that started as work-related questions and meandered into 45-minute conversations about nothing. She had been divorced for 2 years when they met. Her ex-husband, a real estate attorney named Brad, had left her for a woman 12 years younger. Rachel did not speak about Brad often, but when she did, there was a quality of calm devastation in her voice, the sound of someone who had screamed so hard and for so long that they had simply run out of screaming and now existed in a permanent, low-grade state of grief that no longer had the energy to express itself as anger. "He told me I was too independent," Rachel said one evening, swirling the ice in her gin and tonic. They were sitting at a corner booth at O'Malley's, the Irish pub 3 blocks from the office. It was a Thursday. Marcus had told Denise he was staying late to reconcile a shipment discrepancy. He said he felt like he was married to his business partner, not his wife. like I didn't need him. She laughed, and the laugh was somehow worse than crying would have been. And the thing is, he was right. I didn't need him. I thought that was a compliment, that I was self-sufficient. Turns out men want to be needed. Who knew? Marcus had nodded slowly, feeling the words land somewhere deep in his chest, in the part of him that had spent 20 years building a life structured around the principle that he would never, ever need anyone the way his father had needed his mother, with that desperate, clawing, soul-sucking need that had eventually driven her to pack a single suitcase and disappear to Phoenix when Marcus was 17, leaving behind a note that said, "I can't breathe here," and a son who learned from that day forward that the most dangerous thing in the world was another person. He did not need Rachel. He told himself that. He was simply fascinated by her. Intrigued. Professionally and then personally engaged. Denise noticed the change in him before Marcus did. She noticed that he started buying new cologne, Acqua di Gio, the same bottle he'd worn when they were dating, and that he began paying more attention to his clothes, choosing dress shirts in colors that Denise had never seen him wear before. Navy. Burgundy. A soft gray that made his eyes look lighter. "You got a promotion?" she asked one night, touching the sleeve of his new shirt as he loosened his tie at the kitchen counter. Tyler was upstairs in his room, the muffled sound of a video game bleeding through the ceiling. "Something like that," Marcus said, and he kissed her on the forehead, and he meant it kindly, and he went upstairs to shower, where he stood under the water and thought about Rachel Bingham's scar on her left wrist and the way she said the word independence, like it was a medal she'd earned and also a cage she'd built. The first time Marcus kissed Rachel Bingham, they were standing in the parking garage beneath the Hartwell building on a Saturday afternoon in March. The company was closed for a systems audit, and Marcus had come in to retrieve some files from his office. Rachel had done the same, and they had run into each other in the stairwell, literally run into each other, with enough force that Rachel dropped her phone and Marcus reached out instinctively to steady her, and for a moment his hand was on her waist and she was looking up at him and neither of them was breathing. They went to get coffee. Then they went to the parking garage because it was raining and neither of them wanted to sit in a diner or a cafe where someone from work might see them. And in the parking garage, in Marcus's silver Honda Accord that smelled faintly of the pine air freshener Denise had hanging from the rearview mirror for years, Rachel leaned across the center console and kissed him. It was not a tentative kiss. It was the kiss of someone who had been thinking about this for weeks and had decided, in a moment of clarity, that she was done thinking about it and ready to act. Marcus's hands were shaking when he reached up to cup her face. He could feel her pulse through the skin of her jaw, rapid and alive, and he thought, "This is a mistake," and then he thought, "This is the best mistake I've ever made," and then he stopped thinking altogether. When they parted, breathless, Rachel sat back in the passenger seat and looked out the windshield at the concrete pillar in front of them. Water was running down the surface of the pillar in thin rivulets, catching the fluorescent light. "I know you're married," she said. Her voice was steady, practical. It was the voice she used in budget meetings. "I know," Marcus said. "I don't want to break up your family." She turned to look at him. Her eyes were dry. "I want you to understand that. I'm not. This isn't a trap." "I know," he said again, though in the weeks and months that followed, he would come to question whether she meant those words the way he needed her to mean them, or whether she meant them the way they would turn out to be true, which is to say, accurately describing her intentions at that precise moment, but intentions that would change as circumstances shifted and her leverage increased and the calculus of what she wanted from her life evolved in ways that neither she nor Marcus could have predicted on that rainy Saturday in March when everything was still possible and nothing had yet become real. The affair lasted 14 months. Marcus compartmentalized with a discipline that surprised even himself. He kept a second phone, a prepaid Samsung that he kept in the glove compartment of his car and checked only when he was alone. He and Rachel met in hotel rooms in Columbus and Dayton, and once, memorably, in a cabin outside Yellow Springs that Rachel had rented through Airbnb for a weekend in early October when the Ohio hills were doing their annual impression of New England and the maples along Route 42 were burning in shades of red and orange that made Marcus's chest ache with a longing he could not name. Those weekends were the most alive Marcus felt in years. He and Rachel would drive to the cabin separately, arriving 15 minutes apart, and the moment she walked through the door, still in her traveling clothes, her hair windblown, smelling of the cold air, she would come to him and press her face into his neck and breathe him in, and he would hold her, and for those few hours, the rest of the world did not exist. They talked. That was what surprised Marcus most about Rachel, how much they talked. She told him about her childhood in Findlay, Ohio, where her father had been a machinist at a General Motors plant and her mother had worked the morning shift at a Kroger. She told him about the dreams she'd had as a girl of becoming an architect, and how those dreams had quietly died when she got to college and realized that she lacked the mathematical gift required to major in anything other than the soft, forgetting disciplines that were considered acceptable for women of her generation. She told him about Brad, about the slow suffocation of a marriage where affection had been replaced by routine and passion had been replaced by what Brad called mature partnership and Rachel called living with a very clean roommate. She told him about the moment Brad told her he was leaving, and how she had felt, in the very center of her chest, a sensation like a key turning in a lock she hadn't known was there. "I felt relieved," she said. They were lying in bed in the cabin, the window beside them open to the October night, the sound of crickets filling the room like a chorus. Not sad. Not angry. Relieved. Like I'd been holding my breath for 6 years and finally someone told me I could stop. Marcus understood this feeling. He had felt it, he realized, on his own wedding day. They made love slowly that night. Rachel was different from Denise in every way that mattered, more vocal, more demanding, more willing to ask for what she wanted and to punish Marcus with her silence when he failed to provide it. She was 40 pounds lighter than Denise, and she moved through sex with a focused intensity that Marcus found both thrilling and, if he was honest, slightly frightening. She came easily and often, and she was not shy about telling him what felt good and what didn't. In bed, she was decisive in a way that she was not in the rest of her life, or at least, in the rest of the life Marcus had access to. In bed, she was the person she was capable of being when all the defenses were down and the only thing that mattered was the nerve endings in her skin and the animal satisfaction of being touched by someone who wanted to touch her. "Do you think about leaving Denise?" Rachel asked him one morning. They were lying in the narrow bed in the cabin, the quilt tangled around their legs, the smell of sex and pine needles and the cheap coffee they'd made on the hot plate in the kitchen mixing into a scent that Marcus would carry in his memory like an olfactory scar long after everything else about the cabin had faded. "Sometimes," he said. He was being honest. That was part of the problem. "What stops you?" Marcus was quiet for a long time. He could have said Tyler. He could have said the house, or the retirement account, or the shared friends and the shared history and the 20 years of accumulated domestic infrastructure that made the prospect of starting over feel like trying to dismantle a building one brick at a time while it was still occupied. But the real answer was simpler and uglier than that, and Rachel deserved the truth even if it was not kind. "I'm afraid," he said. "Of what?" "Of getting stuck." He turned to look at her. Her face was pillowed on her arm, her hair spread across the pillow like dark water. "I'm afraid of what happens after. When the excitement wears off and we're just two people living together, arguing about whose turn it is to take out the trash. I'm afraid I'll leave Denise for you and then, 5 years from now, I'll be sitting across from you in some restaurant feeling the same way I felt about Denise for the last 5 years before the affair. And by then I'll have destroyed my family and given up my son and burned my whole life to the ground for a feeling that turned out to be just something temporary. Something my body made up to get me to have sex. Rachel was silent. Then she laughed, a short, sharp laugh that was not unkind but that contained within it an edge of something that might have been pity. So you're saying the affair is better than the marriage, she said. Because it stays exciting. Because it never gets to the boring part. No, Marcus said. I'm saying I'm a coward. I'm saying I want the drug without the withdrawal. I want to love you without having to rebuild my entire life around loving you. Rachel sat up. She pulled the sheet around her chest and looked down at him, and her expression was unreadable. You know what I think, she said. I think you're right to be afraid. She stood up, and the sheet fell away, and she walked to the window and looked out at the trees, and Marcus lay in the bed and watched her and felt, for the first time, the ground shifting beneath him, felt the future becoming something uncertain and dark and no longer within his control. Marcus's friend and colleague, the person who would later tell the story, if you could call what happened a story and not a slow-motion catastrophe, was a man named David Okonkwo. David was 45, a senior account executive at Hartwell, and one of those rare people who seemed to have achieved, through some combination of temperament and discipline, the kind of equilibrium that the rest of the men in their 40s could only dream about. He had been married for 19 years to a woman named Sandra who ran a small nonprofit focused on literacy programs in the Columbus public schools. They had 2 daughters, ages 15 and 12, and a golden retriever named Biscuit, and every summer they took a 2-week vacation to a rented cottage on Lake Erie where David could be seen on the porch in the early mornings, drinking black coffee and reading paperback thrillers while Sandra did yoga on the lawn. David was not a saint. He had confided to Marcus, over the years, the small infidelities and near-infidelities that punctuated even the most stable-seeming marriages. The barmaid in Cleveland at the sales conference in 2015 whose hand had lingered on his forearm for a beat too long. The former girlfriend who'd reached out on Facebook in 2018 and exchanged a handful of messages that were innocent on their face but charged with an undercurrent of what might have been. The yoga class at the YMCA where the instructor had been a woman named Christine with extraordinary flexibility and a laugh that sounded like wind chimes, and David had found himself arriving early to every class for 3 months until Sandra mentioned, casually, that Christine had moved to Portland. David was a good man who occasionally entertained the idea of being a different kind of man, and who had, so far, always talked himself back from the edge. His philosophy was one of controlled proximity. He understood that desire was a force of nature and could not be abolished, only managed, like floodwaters or wildfire. You did not eliminate it. You built levees. You cleared fire breaks. You maintained a respectful distance from anything that could burn. This philosophy was tested to its absolute limit when David met a woman named Claire Ashford. Claire was a freelance consultant who came to Hartwell periodically to audit the company's compliance with federal transportation regulations. She was in her late 30s, tall, with auburn hair she wore in a chignon and a pair of green eyes that seemed to be permanently amused by something only she could see. She was sharp-tongued, well-read, and absolutely unwilling to tolerate anything she considered bullshit, which meant that she and David got along brilliantly from the moment she walked into his office on a January afternoon and informed him, with the door still half open, that his expense reports were a disaster and his filing system was an affront to the basic concept of alphabetical order. She was also, David realized within approximately 11 seconds of meeting her, the most attractive woman he had encountered in his entire adult life, and the realization hit him with such physical force that he actually felt slightly dizzy, as though he had stood up too quickly from a seated position. "Miss Ashford," he said, extending his hand, and his voice sounded perfectly normal, which he considered a small miracle given that his pulse had just relocated to somewhere in his throat. "I've heard great things about your work." "From whom?" she said, shaking his hand with a grip that was firm, brief, and utterly businesslike. From a few people," David said, which was a lie, because no one had told him anything about Claire Ashford except that she was punctual, thorough, and didn't suffer fools. He had formed his entire impression of her in the last 11 seconds, and it had nothing to do with her professional reputation. She stayed at Hartwell for 3 weeks that first visit. David found reasons to go to her office, questions about shipping manifests, concerns about the new federal reporting requirements, an elaborate inquiry about a discrepancy in the Q4 numbers that he already understood perfectly and that required no explanation whatsoever. Claire was professional to the point of frostiness. She answered his questions precisely and completely and then found reasons to return to her work, and David, who had spent 2 decades cultivating the appearance of a man who had everything under control, found himself doing something he had never done before. He kept showing up at her door like a dog that had been promised a treat and could not understand why it kept being turned away. On the last day of her audit, she stopped by his office to return a folder she'd borrowed. She was wearing a charcoal suit with a silk blouse the color of champagne, and her hair was down, and she looked so beautiful that David felt a physical sensation in his chest, a kind of clenching, as though his heart had been grabbed by a fist. "Mr. Okonkwo," she said, handing him the folder. "A pleasure, as always." "Please," he said. "It's David." She smiled. It was the first full smile he'd gotten from her. Usually her expressions were more guarded, more carefully rationed, as though she understood the effect she had on men and had developed, through years of practice, the ability to control how much of it she deployed. "David," she said, "you're a good man. I can tell." "How can you tell?" "Because you never once tried anything," she said. "Every man I work with eventually tries something. You're the only one who didn't." She tilted her head slightly, studying him. "It's either very admirable or very suspicious. I haven't decided which." She left. David sat at his desk for 10 minutes afterward, staring at the wall and trying to remember how to breathe normally. The thing about Claire Ashford, the thing that made her different from every other woman David had found himself attracted to, was that she was not simply beautiful. She was beautiful and brilliant and self-possessed and, from everything he could gather about her life, genuinely happy. She lived alone in a renovated loft in the short North District of Columbus. She had been married once, briefly, in her late 20s, and the marriage had ended not in drama but in what she described, during a phone conversation that David would later replay in his memory like a favorite song, as a mutual recognition that we'd peaked too early and had nowhere left to go. She did not want children. She did not want to live in the suburbs. She did not want to have dinner at the same restaurant every anniversary or to spend weekends at home improvement stores picking out paint swatches. She wanted to travel, to read, to do work that mattered, and to be left alone in a manner that suggested she had not the slightest interest in being lonely. David found this intoxicating, and also terrifying, because Claire was the first woman he had encountered in his adult life who did not, in any discernible way, need him. She did not need him for emotional validation, for financial support, for social status, for the completion of Sun Life's script she had been handed at birth. She was complete in and of herself, a full and rounded life in the shape of a person, and the only thing David could offer her was himself, which was either exactly what she wanted or not remotely what she wanted, and there was no way to know which without asking, and asking was the one thing David was not sure he could do. He thought about Sandra. He thought about his daughters. He thought about the cottage on Lake Erie and the golden retriever and the 20 years of accumulated partnership and domestic comfort that constituted the architecture of his daily existence. He thought about what it would mean to walk away from all of it, what it would cost him financially, emotionally, socially. He thought about his mother, who had sacrificed everything for her children and had received, in return, a quiet, undemonstrated gratitude that was not nothing but was also not enough to fill the hollow spaces in her life. He thought about the look on Sandra's face at his sister's wedding when the pastor had talked about love being a choice you make every day, and how Sandra had squeezed his hand under the table and whispered, "That's us," and how David had nodded and smiled and felt, beneath the warmth of her grip, a small cold stone of doubt that had never fully dissolved. He called Claire. The phone rang 4 times and he was about to hang up when she answered. "David." She sounded pleased. "Surprised, baby. To what do I owe the honor?" "I was wondering if you'd like to have dinner," he said. His voice was steady. He was proud of that. "With me. Tomorrow night." A pause. He could hear traffic sounds in the background wherever she was, a city, definitely, and it was still daylight there, which meant she was on the West Coast or maybe in Arizona. He did not know where she was. He should have asked. He had not asked. "Dinner," she repeated. "Like a date." "Like a date," he confirmed. Another pause. Longer this time. David found himself gripping the phone with a ferocity that would have left marks on his palm. "Sandra doesn't know you're calling me, does she?" The question landed like a slap. David's grip on the phone tightened further. "No," he said. "She doesn't." "Then I have to say no," Claire said. Her voice was gentle but firm, the voice of someone who had had this conversation before, with other men, and who had learned from experience that the kindest thing she could do for everyone involved was to refuse clearly and early. "I'm not interested in being someone's secret, David. If you want to have dinner with me, you should do it because you've decided, with your wife, not behind her back, that this is something you want to pursue. And if you've made that decision, then we can have dinner. But not like this. Not sneaking." She waited. David could hear her breathing. He could hear, in the quality of the silence, the full weight of what she was offering him, not just a dinner, but a mirror. A chance to look at himself honestly and decide who he was and what he wanted and whether he was willing to pay the price of getting it. "I can't leave my family," he said. The words surprised him as much as they surprised Claire, he suspected. He had not known he was going to say that until he said it. But once it was out, once he heard himself say it, he understood that it was true. Not permanently, maybe. Not in the sense that he could never imagine a different life. But in the sense that right now, in this moment, on this phone call, the cost of leaving was higher than the benefit of staying, and David, who had built his entire adult life on the principle of cost-benefit analysis, of risk mitigation, of never investing more than he could afford to lose, was not willing to pay the price. "I understand," Claire said. And she did. David could hear that she understood, and that she was not angry, and that she was not disappointed, and that she was, in her way, relieved, because she had been afraid he was going to be one of those men who called her and whispered sweet nothings and pretended that the commitment they'd made to their wives was a minor administrative detail that could be worked around, and she was grateful that David was not that kind of man, even if he was, in a different way, exactly the kind of man who needed her to tell him what he already knew, that the affair he was contemplating was not worth the price, and that the marriage he was thinking about leaving was not actually the prison he had convinced himself it was, but rather the product of 20 years of mutual investment that he was in danger of discarding because a beautiful woman had smiled at him and made him feel, for a moment, the way he had felt on his wedding day before the stone of doubt had settled in his chest. "Thank you," David said. "You're welcome," Claire said. "And David? I mean this in the kindest possible way. Please don't call me again. Not because I'm angry, but because you won't be able to stop yourself eventually, and I don't want to be the reason someone's life falls apart." She was right. She was absolutely right. And David knew it. He deleted her number. He did not tell Sandra about the call. And he went home that night and sat with his wife at the kitchen table and watched her laugh at something Tyler had said, a text message from Tyler upstairs about a glitch in his favorite game, and David felt a sensation that he could only describe as gratitude, a bone-deep, wordless appreciation for the life he had, which was not the life he might have had, but which was, he was beginning to understand, exactly the life he needed. The colleague story, the one about Rachel Bingham and the pregnancy and the wedding that came not from love but from panic and circumstance, unfolded over the months that followed in the way that these things unfold, slowly at first, and then all at once, like a house catching fire. Marcus had tried to end it. He had tried, genuinely and with sincere effort, to end things with Rachel in July, 6 months after the parking garage kiss, 4 months after the cabin in Yellow Springs. He sat her down at a restaurant in the German village neighborhood called Lindy's and told her, in the kindest language he could muster, that he could not leave Denise, that he loved his son more than he could love anyone else, and that the responsible thing, the good thing, the right thing, was for them to stop seeing each other and try to salvage the lives they'd already built. Rachel listened. She did not cry, which Marcus had half expected her to do, because Rachel did not cry easily and because, he would later realize, she had already been through the stages of grief about their relationship long before he'd actually ended it. She had known, perhaps from the beginning, that Marcus would not leave Denise. She had known and she had stayed anyway, and when Marcus finally said the words out loud, "I'm ending this *," Rachel received them with the calm resignation of someone who had been waiting for the other shoe to drop for months and was relieved, finally, to have confirmation. "Okay," she said. She picked up her glass of white wine and took a small sip. "I understand." "I'm sorry," Marcus said. "Don't be sorry," Rachel said. "You were honest with me. That was the one thing I asked for. I can live with this." She paused. "I'm sad, but I can live with it." They finished dinner. They walked to their car separately, as they always did, and Rachel hugged him in the parking lot, a long hug, tight, her face pressed against his shoulder, and when she pulled back her eyes were bright but dry. "Take care of yourself, Marcus Chen," she said. "You're a good man who made some bad decisions. That doesn't make you a bad man." She got in her car. He watched her taillights disappear downtown street. And then he went home to his house in Upper Arlington, where Denise was watching television in the living room and Tyler was upstairs doing homework, and Marcus sat in his car in the driveway for 15 minutes before he went inside, because he needed a moment to feel the full weight of what he had done, what he had successfully avoided doing, and to understand that he had made the right decision, the smart decision, the decision that every rational man in his position would have made, and that it did not feel like the right decision at all. It felt like the biggest loss of his life. He lasted 3 months. The affair resumed in October, which was, in retrospect, the worst possible timing, not because of the season, though October in Columbus carried its own dangers, with the trees turning and the air smelling of wood smoke and the whole city seeming to conspire toward romance, but because by October, Rachel had begun to change. She was different in ways that Marcus could feel before he could articulate. She was more needy, more anxious, more prone to silences that demanded to be filled. She asked him more questions about his plans, his real plans, the ones behind the plans, and she asked them with a patience that was, itself, a form of pressure, the way a hydraulic press is patient. "You say you can't leave her," Rachel said one evening. They were in a hotel room in Dublin, Ohio, a suburb Marcus had chosen specifically because it was far from anyone who might recognize him. Rachel was sitting on the edge of the bed in her robe, and Marcus was standing by the window, looking out at the parking lot. "But you keep coming back to me. So either you don't actually love your wife the way you say you do, or you love her but you love me more, and you're too afraid to admit it." "It's not that simple," Marcus said. "It's exactly that simple," Rachel said. "You're afraid. I understand that. But fear isn't a reason to stay in a marriage that doesn't make you happy. It's just a reason to be miserable in a different way." Marcus turned from the window. Rachel was looking at him with an expression he had never seen on her face before, a kind of stripped bare, unguarded desperation that he found more frightening than anger would have been. "What do you want me to say?" he asked. "I want you to say the truth," Rachel said. "I want you to tell me that you're never going to leave her. And then I can decide whether I want to keep doing this, keep waiting, keep hoping, or whether I should stop. Because I can't keep doing this, Marcus. It's killing me. Whatever this is, love, passion, limerence, I don't care what you call it, it's the most real thing I've ever felt, and I'm wasting it on a man who won't choose me." The truth, Marcus thought. The truth was a luxury he could not afford. If he told Rachel the truth, that he did love her, in whatever broken, insufficient way a married man in love with someone other than his wife could love, that would give her power. It would give her hope. And hope, in the hands of a woman who had already decided she wanted to build a life with him, was a weapon she could use without ever having to acknowledge it as one. "The truth is that I don't know," Marcus said. It was the most honest thing he'd said in months. "I don't know what I want. I don't know what's right. I don't know if I'm capable of being the man you need me to be. And I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." Rachel was quiet for a long time. The television in the hotel room was on, tuned to a news channel at low volume, the anchor's voice a murmur in the background. "Okay," she said finally. "I can live with that. For now." In November, Rachel missed her period. She called Marcus from the parking lot of her apartment building, and the way she said his name, Marcus, made him feel cold before she had told him anything at all. "I'm pregnant," she said. The silence that followed was the longest of Marcus's life. "Are you sure?" "I took 3 tests. They're all positive." Marcus sat down on the stairs of his house. He had just come home from work. The door was behind him. Inside the house, he could hear Denise in the kitchen, the clatter of pots and pans, the low murmur of the public radio station she listened to while she cooked. "What do you want to do?" he asked. "That's not a fair question," Rachel said. "You're asking me what I want to do because you want me to make the decision for you. You want me to say I'll handle it. I'll take care of it. You won't have to be involved. That's not. It is, though. That's exactly what it is." Rachel's voice was shaking, and Marcus realized that she was crying, quietly, the way she did everything, with a discipline that bordered on self-punishment. "I'm not going to have an abortion, Marcus. I'm 34 years old and this might be my only chance to have a child, and I'm not going to let you off the hook by pretending I don't want it. So what do you want from me?" "I want you to make a decision," Rachel said. "Not the easy one. Not the one where you get to keep your life and your family and your wife and your son and I get to disappear and raise your child alone while you send me checks every month from an account your wife doesn't know about. I want you to decide whether you're going to be a father to this child or not. And if you are, that means leaving your wife. And if you're not, then you need to tell me right now, and I'll figure out what to do, and I'll never contact you again. It was, Marcus thought, the most ruthless and also the most reasonable demand anyone had ever made of him. There was no clever answer. There was no way to thread the needle. Rachel had constructed the situation with a precision that left no room for the kind of elegant compromise that men like Marcus had spent their entire adult lives perfecting, the skill of having everything and paying for nothing, of taking what they wanted from a relationship while leaving the relationship itself intact. He went inside. He ate dinner with his family. He helped Tyler with his algebra homework. He lay in bed beside Denise that night and listened to her breathe and stared at the ceiling and felt the future collapsing in on him like a structure that had been built on a fault line. And he understood, truly understood, for the first time in his life, that the things we want and the things we can sustain are not always the same things, and that the distance between desire and consequence is sometimes the distance between one breath and the end of everything. "I have to tell you something," he said to Denise at 2 in the morning. She turned to look at him. She was half asleep, her hair pressed flat against the pillow, her eyes barely open. "Can't it wait until morning?" she murmured. "No," Marcus said. "It can't." The divorce was finalized in March. It was, by any measure, a disaster, not the acrimonious, courtroom drama kind of disaster that made for good stories, but the slow, grinding, soul-eroding kind that left everyone involved diminished in ways they couldn't fully articulate. Denise had not screamed. She had not thrown things. She had sat at the kitchen table and listened to Marcus tell her about Rachel, about the affair, about the pregnancy, about the decision he had been forced to make by the simple, biological fact of another life taking shape inside a woman he had slept with. And when he was done, she had looked at him with an expression of such profound and bottomless sorrow that Marcus had to look away, because it was the worst thing he had ever seen, worse than anger, worse than hatred, worse than anything in the catalog of human pain that he had been prepared for. "I should have known," Denise said. Her voice was very quiet. "The new shirts, the cologne, the Saturdays you said you were working. I'm not stupid, Marcus. I just didn't want to see it." "Denise, don't." She raised a hand. "Don't apologize. Don't explain. Just tell me what happens now." Tyler took the news badly. He was 15, at the exact age when parental divorce is both comprehensible in its logic and devastating in its emotional impact, and he had responded to the news by retreating into his room and his video games and his schoolwork, which had been slipping for months but which now collapsed entirely. His grades, which had been solid BS and occasional As, dropped to DS and an F in trigonometry. He was suspended twice for fighting, one incident at school where he shoved a kid who made a comment about his dad's side piece, and another at a basketball game where he got into it with a security guard who was trying to escort his mother out of the gym after she refused to stop screaming at the referee. Therapy was recommended. Therapy was attempted. Tyler went to 3 sessions and then refused to go back, saying that the therapist was weird and that he didn't need to talk about his feelings. He needed people to stop asking him to talk about his feelings. The wedding to Rachel took place in a small ceremony at the Franklin County Courthouse in April, 4 months before the baby was due. Marcus wore a gray suit. Rachel wore a maternity dress in pale blue that did not flatter her, because nothing flatters a woman who is 6 months pregnant and knows that the man she is marrying chose her not out of love but out of obligation, and that the child she is carrying is not a symbol of their love but a lock that has clicked shut on a door she spent a year trying to open. There were 27 guests. Marcus's sister flew in from Phoenix. David was there, looking uncomfortable in a tie he did not own, And he gave a speech that was gracious and brief and avoided the words mistake and consequences, even though both words hovered in the air like smoke. The officiant was a judge named Patricia Hendricks, who had performed hundreds of these ceremonies and who delivered the standard vows with the practiced indifference of a drive-through window employee reciting an order number. When she pronounced them married, Rachel looked at Marcus and he looked at Rachel, and neither of them smiled. The baby was a boy. They named him Daniel. From the moment Daniel was born, Marcus felt something he had not expected, a love so immediate and so total that it made the love he had felt for Tyler seem pale by comparison, not because it was lesser but because it was different, born in a moment of crisis and sustained by the sheer, grinding labor of fatherhood, rather than grown slowly over 15 years of scraped knees and homework help and video game marathons on Sunday afternoons. He loved Daniel. He loved the weight of him in his arms, the smell of his head, the way he rooted against Marcus's chest when he was hungry. He loved watching Rachel nurse him, the tender exhaustion on her face, the half-smile she gave Marcus when Daniel pulled away and gasped for air. He loved the chaos of 3 a.m. feedings and the terror of the first fever and the ordinary, grinding, magnificent labor of keeping a small human being alive and teaching it, incrementally, how to be a person. But there was always a but, wasn't there? There was always the shadow that fell across everything, the asterisk next to every joy. And the asterisk was Tyler. Tyler, who had not been to see the baby in 4 months. Who had refused to come to the hospital. Who had told his therapist, in the 3rd and final session, that he wished his father had died instead of staying alive in this new, diminished, broken version of himself that Tyler did not recognize and could not forgive. Who was failing all of his classes and had been kicked off the basketball team and whose eyes had developed a quality of flat, preemptive grief that made him look, even at 15, like someone who had already lost everything and was simply waiting for the rest of the world to catch up. Marcus paid for Tyler's private school out of the divorce settlement and the equity in the house that Denise had kept, and the tuition was $42,000 a year, and Marcus did not have $42,000 a year, not with a new baby and a wife who had quit her job to stay home and a house that needed a new roof and a car that was approaching 200,000 miles. He borrowed from his retirement account. He asked his parents, he was 68 and 71, both retired, living on Social Security and a pension that barely covered the mortgage on their house in Westerville, to contribute, and they did, quietly, without complaint, taking money out of savings they did not have to spare. And Rachel's daughter from her previous marriage, a 15-year-old named Chloe whom Marcus had met exactly twice before the wedding and who lived with her father during the school year and with Rachel and Marcus on school breaks and summers, Chloe was also expensive. She had her father's expensive tastes and her mother's belief that she was entitled to whatever she wanted, and she wanted a lot: private music lessons, a new MacBook, clothes from the mall, a trip to Florida with friends over spring break that cost $4,000 and that Rachel approved without consulting Marcus because Rachel's relationship with Chloe was a fault line that neither of them wanted to examine too closely, because Chloe was the living proof of Rachel's previous life and also its most persistent casualty, a girl who had learned from watching her parents divorce that love was a transaction and that men left and that the only reliable form of security was whatever you could extract from someone before they extracted themselves. Marcus paid for Chloe's expenses without complaint. What else could he do? He was her stepfather now, by law and by the simple fact of being married to her mother, and a man who complained about the cost of raising his stepdaughter was, he understood, the same kind of man who complained about the cost of raising his own children, a man who had failed to understand that the cost was not an expense but an investment, and that the return on that investment was measured not in dollars but in the kind of person your children became, and that if you were lucky, luckier than Marcus, in this particular calculus, your children would become people who forgave you for the mistakes you'd made along the way. Marcus saw David at work. They still shared an office suite on the 4th floor of the Hartwell building, and they still had lunch together most days in the company cafeteria, and they still talked about sports and politics and the Bengals' latest catastrophic failure to make the playoffs. But something had shifted between them. David was careful now in a way he hadn't been before, careful with his words, careful with his laughter, careful with the easy physicality of their friendship. He had heard, through the office grapevine, about Marcus's divorce and remarriage, and he had said all the right things at the time. Congratulations on the baby, wishing you all the best, let me know if there's anything I can do. But behind the words was a judgment that David did not need to articulate because Marcus could feel it radiating from him like heat from a furnace. The unspoken, inarguable verdict of a man who had made the right choice and who could not fully understand anymore how another man could have made the wrong one. You look tired, David said one day. They were in the cafeteria, sitting at their usual table by the window. Marcus had a salad he wasn't eating. Outside, the spring sun was doing its best to warm the parking lot, but the wind was coming off the Scioto River in cold, damp gusts that made the sunlight feel like a lie. I am tired, Marcus said. The maybe? All of it. Marcus pushed the salad around with his fork. Tyler won't talk to me. Chloe is a nightmare. Rachel is adjusting. The mortgage on this house is killing me. Denise and I are still fighting about the divorce settlement. My parents are giving me money they can't afford to give. I haven't slept more than 4 hours a night since Daniel was born. And I got passed over for the regional director position last week. They gave it to someone with less seniority because, and I quote, the timing of my personal situation made me seem like a flight risk. David was quiet. He took a sip of his coffee. He set the mug down on the table with the careful precision of a man choosing his next words. Do you regret it? He asked. Marcus looked at him. The question was so simple, 3 words, but it contained within it the entire catastrophe of the last 2 years. The whole sprawling arc of desire and consequence and choice that had led Marcus Chen from his comfortable colonial in Upper Arlington to this moment, this table, this life that bore almost no resemblance to the one he had so carefully built and so carelessly destroyed. Yes, he said. And then, because the truth demanded more than 1 word every single day. That summer, Marcus was transferred to the company's Akron office. It was not a promotion. It was not a lateral move. It was, everyone understood, a demotion dressed up as a relocation, a quiet acknowledgement that a man who had imploded his personal life with such spectacular inefficiency could not be trusted to represent the company in any capacity that required the public-facing confidence that a regional director position demanded. He drove to Akron every day, and an hour each way on Route 77, listening to audiobooks about stoicism and cognitive behavioral therapy and the science of habit formation, trying to construct, out of the ruins of his old life, a new framework for living, one that could accommodate the person he had become and the choices he had made and the people who depended on him now, people he had not planned for and could not easily exit, people who were his responsibility whether he liked it or not and who deserved better from him than the kind of distracted, half-present, perpetually exhausted father and husband he was currently managing to be. Rachel was different since the baby. The edge that had characterized her during the affair, the sharp wit, the self-possession, the controlled independence that had made her so attractive in the first place, had softened into something more vulnerable, more anxious, more demanding. She needed reassurance that Marcus loved her in a way that he could not provide, because Marcus did not know himself whether he loved her or whether he was simply performing the outward behaviors of a man who loved his wife and hoping that the performance would eventually become indistinguishable from the real thing. You're not present, Rachel said one night. Daniel was 8 months old and had just gone down for the night, and they were sitting in the living room of their house in Akron, which was smaller than the house in Upper Arlington and located in a neighborhood that was, Marcus had to admit, several notches down the socioeconomic ladder from what he was used to. "You're here, but you're not here. I can see you thinking about her. Denise? Your other life. The one you gave up." Rachel had gotten good at this, identifying what Marcus was feeling before he could name it himself. It was both her gift and her curse as a partner. She saw him too clearly, and he could not bear to be seen. "I'm not thinking about Denise," Marcus said. It was, of course, a lie. He thought about Denise constantly, not romantically, not longingly, but with the specific, obsessive attention that a man pays to a wound that is healing badly, the one he keeps touching to see if it still hurts. "Then what?" Rachel pressed. "Talk to me. Tell me what you're thinking." Marcus looked at his wife. She was 36 now, 2 years older than when he'd met her, and she looked older in ways that had nothing to do with age. There were lines around her eyes that hadn't been there before, and her hair, which she used to wear in a ponytail, was now almost always pulled back in a bun, and her body, which had been one of the things that had first attracted him to her, had changed in the way that bodies change after pregnancy and breastfeeding and the exhaustion of new motherhood. She was still beautiful. But she was beautiful in a different way now, less like a woman he desired and more like a woman he was accountable to, which was, Marcus understood, exactly the kind of beauty that a man like him was least equipped to appreciate. "I'm thinking about the man I was 2 years ago," he said. "The one who thought he could have everything. Who thought he could eat his cake and have it too. Who thought he could love 2 women at the same time and not destroy both of the relationships in the process." He paused. "I'm thinking about how stupid I was. How arrogant. How convinced I was that I was different from other men, that I could handle it, that I could manage the affair without it becoming real, without it becoming the thing that consumed everything else." "And now?" Rachel asked. "Now I know better," Marcus said. "Now I know that there's no such thing as managing an affair. It's not something you control. It's something that controls you. And by the time you realize that, it's already too late. You've already made the choice. You've already burned the bridge. And all you can do now is live with the consequences." Rachel was quiet for a long time. The television was on, but muted, showing images of a wildfire in California that had consumed 40,000 acres and forced the evacuation of 3 towns. On the screen, a woman in a Red Cross vest was being interviewed, and she was crying, and behind her the sky was orange with smoke and ash. "For what it's worth," Rachel said, "I don't regret it. Any of it. The baby, the marriage, even," she stopped. "Even knowing what it's cost you. What it's cost all of us." "That's easy to say when you're the one who got what you wanted," Marcus said, and he heard the bitterness in his own voice and wished he could take it back, but it was out now, and Rachel heard it, and the look on her face was the look of someone who had just been told the thing they had always suspected but had been too afraid to confirm. "Yes," she said. "I suppose it is." She went upstairs to check on Daniel. Marcus sat alone in the living room and watched the wildfire on television, and he thought about the woman in the Red Cross vest and her tears and the orange sky, and he thought about the way a thing could burn without you even realizing it was on fire until the whole structure was collapsing around you and the only choice left was whether to run or to stay and burn with it. The following spring, on a Saturday afternoon in April, Marcus took Tyler to a Reds game. It was Tyler's idea, a concession he had made, unprompted, during one of his rare moments of direct communication with his father, which usually took the form of monosyllabic text messages, *fine*, "Okay, whatever," sent in response to Marcus's increasingly desperate attempts at contact. I want to go to a Reds game, Tyler had texted. Just us. They sat in the upper deck behind home plate, where the seats were cheap and the sun was merciless, and Tyler, 16 now, tall like his mother, with Denise's brown eyes and Marcus his broad shoulders, ate a hot dog and drank a soda and said almost nothing for the first 3 innings. Marcus didn't push. He had learned, through months of trial and error, that pushing Tyler was the fastest way to make him retreat, so he sat in the metal bleacher seat and watched Joey Votto step into the batter's box and try to enjoy the game the way he might have enjoyed it 2 years ago, before everything. In the 4th inning, with the Reds down 3-1 and the crowd growing restless, Tyler spoke. I know you didn't choose me. Marcus turned to look at his son. Tyler was staring straight ahead, his jaw set, his eyes fixed on the field with the determined focus of someone who had rehearsed what he was about to say and was not about to let emotion derail him. That's not, I know you didn't leave me for her. You left Mom for her. And those are different things. But they feel the same. To me. Marcus opened his mouth to respond, but Tyler held up a hand. I'm not done, he said. I spent a whole year being angry at you. And then I spent another year being angry at Mom, because she didn't fight hard enough to keep you. And then I got angry at myself for being angry at Mom because she didn't do anything wrong. And then I got angry at myself for being angry at myself, and at some point I just ran out of anger. And what was left was just, he paused. Sad. Just this permanent sadness that doesn't go away. Like a noise in my ears that I can't turn off. I know, Marcus said. I know, buddy. I'm so sorry. Don't call me buddy. Tyler's voice was flat. And don't apologize. I didn't ask for an apology. I asked you to come to a baseball game. He turned to look at Marcus, and his eyes were bright with the kind of grief that was too large for a 16-year-old's body, that had no choice but to spill over into every available space. I asked you because I wanted to see if it was still there. The part of you that cares about things that aren't about winning, or getting what you want, or whatever. Just regular things. Hot dogs and baseball and the sun going down and not having to think about any of the people who are waiting for you at home. Marcus looked at the field. A new batter was stepping up, someone young, a rookie, with the nervous energy of someone who was still trying to prove himself. He fouled off 2 pitches and then took a ball, and the crowd murmured with the small excitement of people grateful for any distraction from the game's tedium. It's still there, Marcus said. It's buried. But it's still there. Tyler nodded slowly. He picked up his hot dog, which had gone cold, and took a bite anyway, chewing with the mechanical determination of a teenager who had learned, through hard experience, that sometimes the only way to finish a difficult thing was to simply keep going. Okay, he said. That's enough. They stayed for the rest of the game. The Reds lost 6-3. On the drive home, Marcus's car, Tyler in the passenger seat, the windows down because the April air was finally warm enough to justify it, Tyler reached over and turned on the radio and found a station playing classic rock, and for the last 15 minutes of the drive, father and son listened to Landslide by Fleetwood Mac without speaking, and Marcus thought about the lyrics. The verse about getting older and the chorus about being afraid of the dark, and he thought about how he had spent the last 2 years being afraid of everything except the right things, and how the only person who had really understood that, the only person who had seen through his elaborate performance to the terrified, small, fundamentally weak man underneath, was the 16-year-old boy sitting next to him in the passenger seat, who had every reason in the world to hate him and who had chosen, instead, to go to a baseball game. The following Monday, Marcus filed the paperwork to transfer back to the Columbus office. It meant a pay cut. The Akron position had come with a housing stipend, but it also meant he could drive Tyler to school in the mornings and have dinner with him on weeknights and be present in a way that he had not been present in 2 years. And Marcus understood that the pay cut was not a sacrifice but a correction, a small repayment on a debt he could never fully repay, but that he was committed, finally, to beginning to pay. He told Rachel about the transfer over dinner. She was feeding Daniel, who was now almost 2 and who had developed the particular imperiousness of toddlers everywhere, demanding bites of pasta with a vehemence that was, Marcus had to admit, kind of admirable. "A transfer," Rachel said. She set down Daniel's spoon. "Back to Columbus. It's better for Tyler. And for me. I'll be closer to him. I can be more involved. And what about Daniel? What about us?" "We'll figure it out," Marcus said. It was not a satisfying answer, he knew that, but it was an honest one, and honesty, he was learning, was the only currency that could purchase the kind of trust that Rachel actually needed from him. Not grand gestures. Not total commitment. Just the plain, daily, unglamorous truth. "I'm not going to ask you if you regret it," Rachel said. "I already know the answer. You told me at the Reds game, remember? I heard from Tyler. He texted me." Marcus looked at his son across the room. He was doing homework at the kitchen table, the phone face down beside him, the posture of a boy who had learned to focus despite chaos, and then at his wife, who was looking at him with an expression that contained within it every possible human emotion, and at Daniel, who was smashing a piece of pasta against the high chair tray with the unself-conscious joy of a child who had not yet learned that the world was full of rooms you couldn't escape from. "I don't know if regret is the right word," Marcus said. "It implies that if I had it to do over, I'd do it differently. And I'm not sure that's true. I'm not sure I'd be capable of doing it differently. I think I'd make the same mistakes because I'm the same person. And I hope that what I'm doing now is building something different. Not better. Just different. A life that's honest about what it is, instead of a life that's pretending to be something it's not." Rachel studied him for a long moment. Then she picked up Daniel's spoon and resumed feeding him, and Marcus watched her and thought about the parking garage in Columbia, the white blouse, the 11 seconds of eye contact that had changed everything, and he thought about all the choices that had led from that moment to this one, and he thought about what David had said at O'Malley's that night, when they'd been drinking and the conversation had turned to the thing men do and the things men think and the difference between those two things, which is the difference between desire and action and consequence, which is the difference between the life you imagine and the life you end up living. "A man will walk 1,000 miles towards something he wants," David had said, and then stop at the exact moment when reaching for it would require him to let go of everything else. That's not wisdom. That's just arithmetic. The problem is that love doesn't obey arithmetic. Love is the one equation where you can't balance both sides. Marcus had not understood it then. He was beginning to understand it now. Years later, 5, then 10, then 15, the way years accumulate, each one stacking on top of the last until the tower is so high you can no longer see the ground. Marcus would try to explain this to the younger men at work, the ones who came to him with stories of affairs and near infidelities and women they met at conferences who smiled at them across the bar and made them feel, for a moment, like the men they had imagined themselves to be when they were 20 and thought that wanting something was the same as deserving it. He would sit them down in his office after hours, when the building was quiet and the fluorescent lights were humming in that particular frequency that sounds like the universe expressing mild disapproval, and he would tell them about Rachel and Denise and Tyler and the white blouse and the parking garage and the cabin in Yellow Springs. He would tell them about the moment he understood, truly understood, in his body and his bones and his bank account, that the worst thing a man can do is not to cheat on his wife or leave his family or break a promise. The worst thing a man can do is to convince himself that the affair is sustainable, that he can manage it, that he can have the stability of marriage and the excitement of the affair, the comfort of home and the thrill of the forbidden, without ever having to face the fundamental arithmetic of human relationships, that every choice is also a loss, and that the only way to honor what you've chosen is to grieve what you've lost, and that the men who refuse to grieve, the ones who convince themselves they can have everything and pay for nothing, are the ones who end up paying the highest price, because they spend their whole lives running from the bill. "The affair is not worth it," Marcus would say, and the young man across from him would nod, and would go home, and would call the woman he'd been seeing in hotel rooms in Dublin and Delaware, and would make the same choice that Marcus had made 15 years ago, because that is what men do. They are told the story of the trap, and they listen, and they nod, and they walk into the trap anyway, because desire is not a lesson you learn once and then carry with you for the rest of your life. Desire is a force that renews itself with every new face, every new smile, every new woman who walks past your desk in a white blouse and makes you feel, for one brief moment, like the man you were always supposed to be. And Marcus would watch them go. And he would go home to Rachel, who had been his wife now for longer than she had been his mistress, and who had grown into a woman he respected and admired and, yes, loved, though it was a different kind of love than what he'd felt in the parking garage, the love of something you have built rather than something you have found, the love of a house you've lived in long enough to know every creak in the floor and every draft from the windows, the love of a person who has seen you at your worst and chosen to stay. He would go home, and Tyler would be there. He came for dinner every Sunday, and his son was 28 now, a man with Marcus's shoulders and Denise's eyes and his own particular way of laughing that sounded like surprise, like joy was something he was still not entirely sure he was allowed to feel. And Daniel would be there, 12 years old, obsessed with baseball and ancient Greek mythology, and a girl in his 7th grade class named Sophia who had read his short story in the school literary magazine and told him it was surprisingly good, and Daniel had spent 3 hours in his room replaying that phrase on a loop, trying to figure out if surprisingly good was a compliment or a backhanded insult, and Marcus had sat with him on his bed and explained that surprisingly good was, in the complicated economy of preteen social validation, one of the highest compliments available, and Daniel had looked at him with an expression of such raw, unguarded gratitude that Marcus had had to look away. He would go home, and the house would be full of noise and clatter and the specific exhaustion of a family that had learned to stay together not because the staying was easy but because the alternative, scattering, loss, the permanent ache of people who used to love each other and didn't anymore, was worse. And Marcus would pour himself a glass of wine and sit at the kitchen counter and watch Rachel cook dinner, and he would think about the man he had been at 42, standing in the parking garage, feeling the ground shift beneath him, and he would think about the man he was at 57, sitting at the kitchen counter, feeling the ground beneath him still, finally, after all these years, hold. He would not call it happiness. Happiness was too small a word for what he had. He would call it something else, the thing that remains after the fire has burned out, the structure that is still standing after the earthquake, the love that survives not because it was perfect but because it was chosen, every day, by people who understood that choosing was not the same as wanting, and that wanting was not the same as having, and that having was not the same as keeping, and that keeping was not the same as deserving, but that all of it was worth it, in the end, if you were willing to pay the price. And if you were not willing to pay the price, then the price would find you anyway, in the form of the life you did not live, the children you did not raise, the Sunday dinners you did not have, the moments of ordinary grace you did not witness, the face of your father at 60 reading a book in a cottage by a lake while your mother did yoga on the lawn and your sisters argued about something trivial and the golden retriever slept in the sun. That was the arithmetic. That was the trap. And it was, at the same time, the only door out. Denise Chen did not talk about the divorce in the years that followed. Not with her therapist, not with her sister in Cincinnati, not with the friends who called and texted and stopped by with casseroles and wine and the particular kind of careful, compassionate inquiry that people deploy when they want to know the truth but do not want to cause pain. She had decided, early in the process of rebuilding her life, that the story she told about her marriage would be a story about a man who had made a bad choice, not about a woman who had failed to hold on to him, not about a wife who had been too independent or too distracted or too certain that the life she had built would simply continue to build itself without her constant attention. She was, in this, successful beyond her own expectations. She returned to teaching with a renewed focus that her colleagues attributed to having more time for herself and that her students attributed to Mrs. Chen being scary good at catching people who haven't done the reading. She dated, briefly, a widower named Paul who sold mutual funds and who had the particular earnestness of a man who had never been seriously questioned about anything in his life. The relationship lasted 8 months and ended not in drama but in a mutual acknowledgement that neither of them was more than half awake in the other's presence. Denise preferred her own company, in the end. She had discovered something that many divorced women discover in their 40s, that the absence of a partner was not the same as the absence of intimacy. She had friends. She had her son, on alternate weekends and every Wednesday for dinner. She had her garden, her books, her Wednesday night yoga class, her Sunday morning farmer's market routine, her life, which was, she came to understand, not a consolation prize but a genuine article, a life that was hers and that she had not so much chosen as grown, organically, from the soil of her own preferences and needs. She saw Marcus at Tyler's high school graduation. They sat on opposite sides of the gymnasium and did not speak. But Denise watched him from across the room, the way he sat with his shoulders slightly hunched, the way he laughed at something Tyler said, the way he looked, at 56, older than she felt, and she felt, toward him, something that was not anger and not grief but a kind of distant, anthropological curiosity, the way you might look at a photograph of yourself from 20 years ago and marvel at the person you used to be. He had been a good husband, she thought, for the first 12 years. Reliable, kind, present in the way that most men are present when they have not yet been tested. The affair had not been his defining moment. It had been, rather, a revelation, a disclosure of something that had always been true about him, which was that he was capable of compartmentalizing his life into separate, airtight chambers, and that the chamber he kept for himself, his desires, his wants, his hunger for something he could not name, was larger and more powerful than the chamber he kept for his family. She did not blame him. That was the thing she could not explain to her therapist, who kept probing for anger that was not there, or to her sister, who wanted her to be angrier because anger was easier to understand. Denise did not blame Marcus because she understood, in a way that she suspected Marcus did not yet understand about himself, that he had done what men do. He had followed his desire to its logical conclusion. He had made the choice that the desire demanded. And then he had lived with the consequences, which were different from the consequences he had imagined but which were, in their own way, exactly the consequences he had been trying to avoid: loss, limitation, the discovery that the thing you wanted was not the thing you needed. Taylor had asked her once, in the middle of his sophomore year, when the anger was still fresh and the therapy was still ongoing, whether she thought Dad was happy. "I don't know," Denise had said. "Why do you ask?" "Because I want him to be," Tyler had said. And then, after a long pause, "But I also want him to know that he hurt me. And I don't know if those two things can exist at the same time." Denise had put her arm around her son and held him, and they had sat together on the couch in the living room of the house that was now hers alone, and she had thought about the nature of love and the nature of pain and the way those two things were so often the same thing, the same wound, the same scar tissue forming around the same raw place. They can exist at the same time, she had said. That's the hardest part. That's what no one tells you. On a Sunday evening in September, 5 years after the divorce was finalized, Denise received a text from Marcus. They had exchanged texts perhaps a dozen times in the intervening years: logistics, Tyler's schedule, the occasional civil remark about weather or traffic, and the text she received that evening was different from the others. I'm not sure how to say this, so I'll just say it. I've been thinking about the day I told you. The kitchen. 2 in the morning. And I've been thinking about your face. The way you looked. And I want you to know that I have never stopped being sorry. Not a single day. Not one. Denise read the text 3 times. She was sitting in her garden, the September roses blooming in defiance of the cooling air, the last of the summer light fading over the houses on the next block. She thought about deleting it. She thought about responding with something short and dismissive, the kind of response that would protect her from having to feel whatever she was about to feel. Instead, she typed, "Thank you for saying that. I believe you, asterisk." She paused. Then she added, "I'm okay, Marcus. Truly okay. I hope you are too, asterisk." His response came 3 minutes later, "I'm getting there. Some days more than others, asterisk." And then, a minute after that, "Take care of yourself, Denise. You deserved better, asterisk." Denise put the phone down. She sat in her garden as the light faded and the first stars appeared and the roses closed their petals against the coming night, and she felt something shift in her chest, something that had been clenched for years finally, slowly, beginning to release. She had not needed his apology. She had built her life without it, brick by brick, into something that was entirely hers and that did not depend on Marcus's recognition of what he had done. But the apology had mattered anyway, in the way that acknowledgments matter, in the way that being seen by the person who hurt you matters, even after you have stopped needing to be seen. She went inside. She made herself a cup of tea. She sat at the cut-up table and looked at the photograph on the wall, Tyler at 8, gap-toothed and grinning, sitting on Marcus's shoulders at some carnival or fair, and she smiled, not because the photograph no longer hurt, but because it hurt in a way that was no longer sharp, no longer urgent, no longer the kind of pain that demanded attention. She had survived. She had rebuilt. She had become, through the alchemy of time and effort and the quiet, daily work of choosing herself, someone who was okay. And that, she thought, was the only victory worth claiming. Tyler got married in June, in a garden ceremony at the Blackwell Hotel in Ann Arbor, Michigan. His bride was a woman named Amy who had been his roommate in college and who had, according to Tyler's tearful toast at the rehearsal dinner, taught me that love doesn't have to be a performance. It can just be showing up. Every day. For the rest of your life. Marcus sat in the 3rd row, between Rachel and Daniel, and watched his son give the toast, and he cried openly, without shame, in the way that men cry when they have finally learned that tears are not a failure of masculinity but simply a response to being overwhelmed by something too large to contain. He cried because Tyler had become a man he was proud of. He cried because the woman Tyler was marrying was exactly the kind of woman who would be good for him, steady, kind, deeply herself in a way that did not require validation. He cried because he understood, watching Tyler stand at the podium with his notes in his hand and his voice steady, that he had played a role, however small, however indirect, in creating this moment, and that the role had been worth playing, despite everything. Denise was at the wedding too. She sat in the 2nd row, between her sister and a college friend named Karen who had been her roommate the year Denise turned 40 and who had flown in from Boston with a gift basket and a willingness to drink bourbon on the hotel balcony until 2 in the morning. Denise wore a dress in a shade of deep blue that Marcus had once told her made her look like the ocean, and when she caught his eye across the reception hall, during the father-son dance, when Tyler was spinning Rachel around the floor and the rest of the room was watching with the particular attention that weddings demand, she raised her glass to him, just slightly, just enough. He raised his glass in return. It was not forgiveness, that small gesture. Forgiveness was too large a word, too neat a conclusion for something that had never been simple. But it was acknowledgement. It was recognition. It was two people who had once loved each other and had hurt each other in ways that neither could fully articulate, choosing, for this one moment, in this one room, surrounded by the people they had created together, to see each other clearly and to allow that seeing to be enough. The reception moved into the ballroom of the Blackwell Hotel, and Marcus found himself standing by the floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the Huron River, a glass of champagne warming in his hand. The room was full of people he did not know, Amy's family, Amy's friends, the sprawling social network that any person accumulates over 30 years of living, and he felt, standing by the window, the particular loneliness of a man who has arrived at a celebration that is not quite his own. Rachel found him there. She had Daniel on her hip. He was 7 now, old enough to be set down but young enough to demand to be held, and he had developed, over the years, the particular art of making himself impossible to put down, the way small children do when they sense that the adults around them are unsteady. "You look pensive," Rachel said. She slid her arm through his, the gesture easy and familiar after 11 years of marriage. They had learned, Marcus and Rachel, how to be married, not the fairy tale version, not the Hollywood version, but the real version, which was quieter and more work and required more humility than either of them had expected. "What's on your mind?" "I was thinking about Denise," Marcus said. It was easier to say this now than it had been in the early years, when the mere mention of her name could set off a 3-day silence. "And Tyler. And how strange it is that we're all here, in the same room, after everything." Rachel nodded. She was not the woman she had been when Marcus had first met her, not the sharp-edged, anxious, secretly furious woman who had gotten pregnant and forced the issue that Marcus had been trying to avoid. She had softened, over the years, in the way that people soften when they realize that the armor they have been wearing was never as necessary as they thought. She had gone back to work when Daniel started kindergarten. She was now a controller at a healthcare company in Akron, and she was good at it, and she came home every evening with the particular exhaustion of someone who had used her brain all day and had nothing left for the evening but the basics. "Denise looked beautiful tonight," Rachel said. It was not a generous observation in a way that some women make generous observations, saccharine, performative, designed to demonstrate their own security. It was simply true, stated plainly, the way Rachel stated most things. "That blue dress." "She always looked good in blue," Marcus said. He did not say it wistfully. He did not say it with longing. He said it the way you might note that the sky is blue or that the river is wide, simply observing a fact about the world. "I used to hate her," Rachel said. "Did you know that?" When we were first together. I used to lie in bed at night and imagine meeting her. I had this whole fantasy where I would be calm and superior and she would see me with you and she would finally understand that she had lost. That she had lost to someone better. And now?" Rachel laughed. It was a short, rueful sound. "Now I've met her. At Tyler's graduation 2 years ago. We talked for 20 minutes in the parking lot while you were inside signing some paperwork. She's fine. She's a good person. But I realized, standing there talking to her, that I never lost to her. We were never competing for the same thing. She wanted a life that was steady and reliable, and she built it. I wanted a life that was, I don't know, alive, dangerous. And I got that. And the price of that was, she gestured vaguely at the room, at Tyler across the dance floor, at the whole complicated structure of their lives. All of this. The good parts and the bad parts. The parts that are worth it and the parts that aren't. Marcus took a sip of champagne. The bubbles were going flat. He had been standing here too long, but he drank it anyway, because the alternative was to think too hard about what Rachel had just said. "Do you regret it?" he asked. "Marrying me?" Rachel was quiet for a long time. Daniel shifted on her hip, mumbling something about cake, and she shifted him to the other side with the practiced ease of a mother who had been carrying children for over a decade. "I don't know if regret is the right word," she said. "Regret implies that I would choose differently if I could go back. And I'm not sure I would. I have Daniel. I have a life that is mine. Not the life I imagined, but the life I have. And I worked for it. I fought for it. I made choices that hurt people, and I lived with the consequences, and I'm still standing. And that counts for something. Even if the price was higher than I expected." She turned to look at him. Her eyes were bright, not with tears, but with the particular clarity that comes from having worked through something difficult and emerged, on the other side, with a sense of perspective that can only be purchased through pain. "I love you," she said. "That's the thing I can't figure out, even after all these years. I love you, and I don't trust you completely, and I'm not sure those two things can coexist in a way that makes a marriage work. But we're still here. 11 years. And Daniel is thriving, and the bills are paid, and we haven't killed each other, and I guess that's the best we can do." Marcus put his arm around her. He pulled her close, and Daniel between them, and they stood by the window and watched Tyler dance with his new wife, and the room was full of people celebrating love in all its various forms, the found and the lost, the chosen and the squandered. And Marcus thought about all the years he had spent trying to have everything, and all the years he had spent learning that everything was not an option, and all the years he hoped to spend, going forward, in the quiet gratitude of having been given something that was not everything, but that was, in its own imperfect way, enough. Years later, when Tyler and Amy had children of their own, a boy named James and a girl named Lily, Marcus would drive up from Akron every other weekend to babysit while Tyler and Amy went out for date nights. He would sit on the floor of their living room in Ann Arbor, building block towers with James while Lily napped in the next room, and he would think about all the weekends he had missed with Tyler, during the divorce, during the years when Tyler wouldn't speak to him, during the long years of rebuilding trust one small gesture at a time, and he would feel the weight of that loss, not as something he had moved past, but as something he was still, in some fundamental sense, carrying. But he would also feel something else, gratitude. For the chance to be here. For the opportunity to do it again, differently. For the extraordinary gift of a second chapter, even if the second chapter was quieter and more modest than the first one had promised to be. Rachel came with him, sometimes. When Daniel didn't have soccer. When the drive wasn't too long. When they were in one of their rare good stretches, where the marriage felt less like an obligation and more like a choice they were actively making together. And sometimes Denise came too, not as a guest, but as family. As Tyler's mother, and James's grandmother, and the woman who had, in the end, chosen to be part of the complicated, messy, loving structure that had formed around her son's family. They were not all friends. They would never be all friends. But they were all present. And that, Marcus had come to understand, was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything.